This is Ilm Circle, a learning workshop presented by the Islamic Speakers Bureau of Arizona, or ISBA. Ilm stands for Intentional Learning for Mutual Respect, the foundation of what ISBA is all about.
So thank you everybody for joining us today. My name is Uzma Jaffrey on behalf of the Islamic Speakers Bureau of Arizona. Thank you so much for joining us today. We are super duper excited to be learning today about Hinduism. And I feel like as a child of Bollywood, I know a lot about it. I feel like I learned more about Hinduism first before I learned about Islam growing up, but I love it. Talking to us today is Dr. Shreekrishna Akilesh. And he is truly a fourth culture kid born in Oman, having lived in Saudi Arabia and India. He's been raised very multi-religiously or in interfaith communities pretty much his whole life, and now graces Phoenix with his knowledge both professionally and personally as a practicing Hindu. So he's going to give us an overview tonight of Hinduism, including the Hindu concept of the beginning scriptures and the concept of time. He has, I'm going to give you a lot of professional stuff. So, because a lot of us have kids and this matters to us. He's a pediatric dentist here in Phoenix, Arizona, having attended Washington University in St. Louis. This is really cool. He actually majored in ceramics, and it's really relevant because obviously after you get a degree in ceramics, you're going to go on to Harvard Dental School and you're going to become a dentist. But not only that, caring about his community is really, really important to him. And you can tell because he pursued also a Master of Public Health at Harvard School of Health, specialized in pediatric dentistry after that at the University of Connecticut. And currently he is working as a senior associate director, overseeing the training and education of pediatric dental residents right here locally. So we are super excited to have Dr. Akilesh with us. Welcome.
Thank you. So I am going to go ahead and share my screen, but before I do that, I just want to throw a couple of things out there. So I mentioned to Uzma before everyone joined that you're all welcome to ask questions. The presentation, I feel like, is more effective if you ask questions that you have. I'm sure all of you have had some exposure to Hinduism. Maybe it's through Bollywood, maybe it's through pop culture. A lot of the words, there's a lot of words that float around that have been appropriated. For example, it's karma, for instance. So that's one term, or things like mantras or chanting Om and stuff like that. So if you, and people have, malas, these prayer beads. And so if you have questions about any of that, and it doesn't have to be related to the slide we're talking about, you can always interrupt and ask the question. Uzma is going to monitor the chat line. And so, and I would prefer to be interrupted when I'm going through the slides, because I think it sort of breaks things up. And it doesn't allow for the presentation to become so monotonous until you get to the end. I'd rather have it be interactive, and then this way your understanding will change and develop as we go through the presentation. So, all right, so are we ready for me to share my screen? So again, everyone, welcome and good evening. So today I'm going to be talking about Hinduism. And so just very briefly, an overview. When I worked on this presentation initially, it was very daunting for me because for me, it almost felt like I was trying to do a very short presentation on the history of time. And Hinduism is the oldest currently practiced religion in the world. So when you look at, when you watch documentaries on National Geographic, for instance, and they show the Egyptians and they show the Assyrians, this is a religion that was practiced while those cultures, religions rose and fell in practice. So it's something that it took me a while to realize when I was growing up how old it was. But I think the more I delved into history and the practice of other religions, I realized actually how old it was. I will also be reviewing, doing a brief overview of the scriptures, the predominant scriptures in Hinduism, and I'll share some cool things about that. And the fact that it's so old adds another dimension to it. So there's more to come on that. It is the source religion for many offshoots. So I'm sure all of you have heard of Buddhism. Some of you might be familiar with Sikhism because they wear a turban. And and unfortunately, there was an incident after 9/11 where a Sikh was mistaken for being Muslim in Phoenix. And so it's interesting how the religion of Sikhism was sort of unites Hinduism and Islam in some ways. So there are many offshoots that came about. Just very briefly, Jainism, if I'm not mistaken, predates 500 BCE. Buddhism is around the time of 500 BCE. And then Sikhism, of course, is from the Middle Ages in India. So along with a lot of the devotional traditions that arose at that time, it's very interesting to look at the Middle Ages just as a period across the world. When I was growing up, I used to be obsessed with watching this documentary. I don't even remember what channel it was on. It was called Biblical Mysteries. And I think it was Leonard Nimoy who was the narrator for that documentary. And regardless of which topic they covered in that documentary, they'd always zoom out and they'd show the map of the world. And they would talk about what was happening across the world at a particular time in history. And I think it's very interesting that if you look at history, there's a common thread that's connecting humanity. If you look at the 10th century, for instance, the concept of the king as being God's representative on earth is something that pervades the world. Like even in India at that time, the king actually became God's representative. The way the temple worship was conducted was very much like the way the king conducted his court, for instance. So it's very interesting to look at, on the face of it, they may look different, they may sound different, they may have different names, but I think there's a common thread that unites all of us. The truth is one, but the paths are many. And I think of any religion in the world, I would say that Hinduism is probably the one where the diversity of the paths that are leading to the same goal is quite striking. So it's predominantly practiced in India, but there's a huge Indian diaspora. So pretty much any major city that you go to, if you go to an emergency room or if you go to a dental clinic or a medical clinic, you're going to see an Indian doctor, or you're probably going to call a 1-800 number and have like an Indian, engineer on the phone helping you with your computer problems. So now Hinduism is practiced pretty much all over the world. There are communities that had Indian diasporas for a significant duration of time. So I would say in the United States, the Indian community probably dates to probably the 60s at the very earliest. And in other countries like Guyana, Indians were actually recruited for farm labor. And so the communities, like even in Singapore and Malaysia, for instance, so those communities are actually a lot older, even though, they're not directly connected to India anymore. So, and the practice of Hinduism that they engage in has its own flavor because it's sort of been separated from the mothership, so to speak, for quite a long time. So just as an example, I lived in Singapore when I was 5 years old. The practice of Hinduism in Singapore is very much alive, very vibrant, and very festive. And I think one major difference is it's very clean, because in Singapore, if you even spit on the sidewalk, you get fined $100. So the feel and look of it is very different from what it would be in India. So what is Hinduism? So when I was growing up and I asked my father this question, he would keep saying that Hinduism is a way of life. It's not a religion per se. And I think it's not considered a religion because it doesn't have a founder. And I think that's one of the things that differentiates it from probably other world religions. It's supposed to be, it's called Sanatan Dharma. That's the way the Hindus refer to Hinduism. So the term Hinduism actually came around with the British, because India was colonized by the British. And it was also colonized by many different cultures before that. But the British gave the term Hinduism, and so the terminology with isms actually came from that. There isn't any term like that in India. The term that they use is Sanatan Dharma. And Sanatan means eternal, and Dharma is the path of righteousness. It's a very loose translation of the term. The the word dharma has many different connotations to it. So, but that's the easiest translation I can share with all of you this evening. Everything is part and parcel of the divine. That's a huge, it's a huge concept to wrap your head around, that everything that you see is a reflection of the divine. And I think it's very interesting when you look at dualistic traditions. So most major world religions have some form of dualism. So for those of you who may not be familiar with that term, the idea of good and evil is a dualistic concept. The idea of God and another being, like Satan, for instance, is a dualistic concept. And in Hinduism, on a relative level, they have this concept of dualism, but on the ultimate level, there is no dualism. So the gods and the demons fight, and they're all from the same source. And just like we fight, and we're actually all still from the same source. And so our differences, as significant as they may seem, they're all still relative to this plane, which is temporary. And on the absolute level, there is no difference between us. And so there's no difference between the soul and God. And I think that's it's something that I have to confess I struggled with. There are relatively dualistic traditions in India. A lot of the devotional cults are dualistic, because in order to practice devotion, you have to have an object of devotion. You have to have something to direct your devotion to. And so those traditions tend to not go with this absolute monism, where you become one with the divine, because they're concerned that once you become one with the divine, then who do you worship and who do you glorify? And you've sort of obliterated your identity as a devotee of God. But I think on the ultimate level, that answers a lot of questions, that if you are one with the divine, then everything that you look at is a reflection of yourself. And then these ideas of the other is not different from you, and they're all part and parcel of the same thing, and they're all part and parcel of you, becomes a little bit more prominent. So this world is considered to be divine play, and different traditions or subsects in Hinduism explain the reason for this divine play slightly differently. So some would say that it happens because of ignorance, and this ignorance, it covers the soul, which is of the nature of God, and that ignorance basically causes this perceived separation, where you see yourself as different from everything else, and you see yourself as different from God. The devotional traditions tend to view it as this divine play is all for God's enjoyment, and that even when we're happy, it pleases God, and when we're sad because of our circumstances, then even that's part of God's play in our life. And by accepting it graciously, we're demonstrating our love and surrender to God. So the beginning, so this, just a little caveat about this, these are all dated per Western history. In India, you will, even if you talk to like a Vedic scholar or a Hindu scholar, they really won't ascribe dates to it, because the idea that the tradition is really timeless. It really never had a beginning. It really never had a founder. And so the idea of dating it is sort of irrelevant to the practice of Hinduism. But nevertheless, just to give everyone an idea, because we're all living in the West, and we all probably went to school with Western history, they date the Indus Valley civilization. So the Indus River is between India and Pakistan, and they date that civilization to about 3000 BC. And they date the Aryans to about 2000 to 1500 BC. Now, the Aryans are supposed to be essentially from the Caucasian mountain range, and they crossed that mountain range and they came to India, and they crossed basically through the northwest corner of India and entered India. And so a lot of the British historians would attribute the Vedic tradition as imported by the Aryans. And now currently in India, there's an understanding that the Vedic tradition was native to India, and the idea that the Aryans brought it to India was something that in some ways demeans the Hindu tradition, that it was actually imported. I'm not really sure on the accuracy of either argument, but I think just taking a step back and looking at the whole tradition, even my own spiritual teachers have never talked to me about the dates of things. And I think their idea behind that is not only is it beginningless, but the discussion of that is not relevant. So the idea about, this is a perfect example. Buddha was actually giving an example to a student. The student asked him, does God exist? And for one student, he said God does. For another student, he said God doesn't. And so both students compared their answers, and then they went back to Buddha and asked him, well, how come you told him something different from what you told me? And the Buddha gives a very good example of when a person's struck by a poisonous arrow, asking questions about where was this arrow made, and where was the arrowhead mined, and what metal is it made from, and what's the alloy, are not relevant questions. So the practice of the tradition really doesn't have anything to do with its historical path, and specifically dating different things to different time periods. So, but just very quickly, the Vedic period is supposed to be the oldest. And the scriptures called the Vedas are the oldest scriptures that I'm aware of. And they date, some of them date to 1500, they say 500 BC. I think some of them are even older than that. If I'm not mistaken, I'm trying to remember where I heard this quote, but there is one of the Vedas is actually sung, so it sounds like music, and the notes are extremely complex. Different families belong to different Vedas, where that's what their family chanted over the ages, and they were responsible for preserving it. And so the Veda that I belong to is the one that's sung, and it's not chanted. And it's extremely complex. It's the origin of Indian music. So the 7 notes of Indian music come from the 7 meters of this sacred text. And I think it was in a BBC documentary that they actually said that listening to the chanting of this, or the singing of these scriptures, is like listening to a 3,000-year-old sound recording. And my teacher is teaching me, and I actually wish I had the book in front of me so I could show it to you, but there's no way you can notate the way it's chanted or sung, because it's so complex that there's no notation system that's possible for it. So you have to learn it from a teacher, and that's how it was taught, and books or even palm leaf manuscripts didn't make an appearance until really the 10th century of the Common Era. So it's really amazing that it's been chanted the same way for such a long time, despite the ravages of time and history and colonialism. Now, the more recently, the Upanishad tradition, so this would be where they're actually codifying the philosophical system. And so the concepts of that you are one with God and that God is all pervasive, these concepts really come from the Upanishads. The Vedas are basically poems, and they're very abstract, and they refer to many different deities, but they're cryptic and they're very poetic. And they are that way. My sense is that it's done in that way for a purpose, because it allows everyone to interpret it as they wish. So you may have a tradition that worships one particular deity as supreme, and another sect worships a different deity as supreme. The Vedas would support them all because they're so nuanced. So I'll give you an example. If there's Vishnu and Shiva, and we'll go over some of these deities in the coming slides. The tradition that worships Vishnu would say that even the name Shiva is actually an epithet for Vishnu. And so that's how they would accept their interpretation of the Vedas, as an example. The Upanishads are extremely, the tradition of Vedanta, so some of you may know about the Vedanta Society more recently, which was established in the West, I think, after Swami Vivekananda actually presented, he spoke at the United Nations. So that tradition basically is a thought tradition, and it speaks about philosophy. It's extremely mind-bending, in my opinion. It doesn't have a devotional bent per se, it's just dry philosophy. So that really originates from the Upanishads, which come a little bit later than the Vedas. So I went over the Vedas. There's four. There's the Rig Veda, the Yajur Veda, and the Sama Veda, which is the one that I said was sung. That's the one I belong to, and the Atharva Veda. So they're all basically hymns, and there's thousands and thousands of these hymns. They're sung on different occasions. The Samaveda provides the musical meters for the other Vedas to be sung. So it's very special in its own right. It sounds almost like a Gregorian chant. It sounds very beautiful and very haunting. The other Vedas are chanted, and so they sound more like what you would probably hear in a Bollywood movie. The Samaveda sounds, interestingly enough, given the audience that I'm speaking with, it actually, when I was young and I heard the Samaveda chanted, it actually sounded like the Islamic call to prayer. It has a lot of notes that are not normally used, and so and it relies on the strength of the singer's voice. So that's something that I'm learning currently with my teacher now, and it's extremely difficult. Just two verses takes a month to learn, because he keeps correcting my singing and tries to make sure. It's almost like Jewish, it would almost be like Hebrew cantillation, where you really have to have a teacher sit with you and keep correcting you to make sure that you're singing it correctly. But the upside of it is that once you learn it, even if you're on your deathbed, you can sing it from memory, because it's programmed into you. And even if you make a mistake, in your mind, you can hear what it's supposed to sound like. And I think that's amazing. It's been a very challenging, but very positive experience for me. The Upanishads, there's many of them. There's 108 main ones. And as I said before, they deal with philosophy. They're the foundation for different philosophical schools. And each of them is trying to address how to view the ultimate reality. So each of them have different perspectives, and they categorize in different ways. So the most recent scriptures are the Puranas, and Purana means ancient. So these are dated from 300 to 1000 CE. There are some minor Puranas that even date from a later period than that, from the Middle Ages. There's 18 main ones, and each Purana has to cover a certain list of topics. So they talk about genealogies, they talk about the greatness of different places of pilgrimage. They also have stories, and I would say many of them are allegorical. And then they also usually have a section on cosmology, where they'll talk about the structure of the universe. They're not considered authoritative because many of them can be contradictory. They are sectarian. And I was recently reading that that the scholars have actually said that they're sectarian on purpose, because these Puranas were meant to inspire people who belong to particular sects to be steadfast in their devotion for their particular sect or tradition. And that's supposed to give them, the firm footing of their faith to then progress on the path. So ultimately, everything is one, but it's sort of, I'm trying to come up with an analogy. Like if I say that I'm one and I'm all pervasive, I'm not going to get up and do anything. And I'm still one person, and I still have a relative situation and a relative circumstance that I have to function in. And so these sectarian viewpoints that are supported by the Puranas allow for you to function on a day-to-day basis. So if I just say that God is one and we are all part of God, then, what do I get up and do? And who do I ask for help? Or what do I teach my children, for instance? It becomes quite complicated. And so this sort of addresses that, and it gives them a way of understanding God in a more relative sense. And many of these Puranas are very devotional. So they talk about the exploits of, I would almost say in a sense that the Gospels would sort of be like Puranas, where they talk about the exploits of Jesus and Some of them focus on his miracles. Some of them focus more on his human characteristics. Some of them focus more on his divine attributes. And these are all really meant to give information, but also to make one's faith steadfast, so that one sticks to that particular path that they've chosen as a Christian, and so they can ultimately realize the divine absolute. So I think that would be a very good way for me to, I'm not a Christian scholar, so that's a caveat, but that's the best analogy I can make so that you can understand. So in addition to those three, so the Vedas, the Upanishads and Puranas, you also have the Itihasas. So the Itihasas are sacred histories, and they include the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. So these are the two most famous ones. They are not history in the Western sense. And I really like this because I think the challenge that the Judeo-Christian traditions face is, and I think it's an advantage that they have, but I think it's also a challenge, that everything is grounded in history. And so if you don't find historical evidence, then it can sometimes undermine a person's belief in the authenticity of a tradition or an account. And I think for Hinduism, the advantage is that these histories are sacred histories and they're not myth. So I never use the term myth or mythology because it just means that it's not real. The best example that I can give is if you go to sleep tonight and you have a dream and you wake up tomorrow morning and you remember the dream and you call me up on the phone and you tell me, you narrate the entire dream in vivid detail to me. Now, my question to you would be, is your dream real or is it a myth? And you can't really say one or the other because it was your reality when you experienced it in a sleep state, but it doesn't mean it's fake or it's not real or it doesn't have an existence. And so I think these sacred histories are really part of sort of the collective unconscious. It's the way of the tradition storing lessons and different concepts that are then conveyed over time. So in the Ramayana, it's the story of Lord Rama and how his wife gets kidnapped and he has to engage in this battle and rescue her, and then he rules his kingdom justly. In India, there is a more logical movement to seeing, okay, so Rama built a bridge across the ocean to Sri Lanka. NASA has actually found pictures of this bridge. And the problem with doing that is then you're missing the point of why the story was even told. The story was really told not for you to be able to find the actual bridge and go to outer space and take pictures of it and then believe that the Ramayana has some value for you. The Ramayana should have value for you based on just the story that it portrays.
Okay, then get the
So the Bhagavad Gita is another very famous scripture. I think the easiest way I can explain how some of you may have been exposed to the Bhagavad Gita would be, this is the text that usually is used in courthouses for people to swear on if they're Hindu. So this is the most common text. I think it's used because it's short and all the other texts are longer. And it's something relatively easy that you can buy. It's sort of published in a Bible type format with with sort of the wax paper pages and the gold leaf on the binding. So it's part of the Mahabharata, and it's a conversation between Lord Krishna and Arjuna. And it spans 700 verses that are in 18 chapters. And each chapter is titled with a different name, and it's termed a yoga. So I'll go over yoga. I have a slide on it, so because I'm sure some of you have questions on it. And it covers different concepts. So it covers the paths of karma, which is action, jnana, which is wisdom, and bhakti, which is devotion. The concept of duty in this life. One very poignant example that Krishna gives Arjuna. Arjuna asks Krishna, is it more important for us to do someone else's duty perfectly than to do our own? And Krishna says, even if one does one's own duty only 1 or 5%, it's still better than doing someone else's duty 100%. And it's very haunting because it basically means that everyone has to do what they're called to do and not necessarily try to do someone else's calling perfectly. It also talks about the nature of the soul, and which is in Sanskrit, it's called Atma, and how the soul is imperishable, indestructible, indivisible, and all pervasive. It also covers the concepts of birth, rebirth, and liberation. And just, just like all the religious texts, they have different interpretations in different schools. The devotional schools will cover more of a devotional perspective. The schools that are more philosophical will focus more on the larger concepts and take a more philosophical bend to interpreting the verses from the scripture. So the concept of time, I put this slide in because the Hindu concept of time is probably very different. It's probably closer to what the Aztecs and the Mayans had. All of you, I'm sure, 2012, the Mayan calendar, it didn't alarm me as much because it reminded me of the Hindu calendar, where once a cycle ends, it just means the cycle it begins again. And for instance, in the Hindu calendar, they have a cycle of 60 years. And once the cycle is finished, it just begins again. And it's a chance, it's sort of like a big new year, where it's a chance to, make an aspiration for a change in your life. But it doesn't necessarily mean that the world is going to end, because the world, even the turnover of the world, the destruction and recreation of the world, it happens in such a cosmic scale that it's going to basically, it's going to happen not in our lifetime. So it's not something that I'm ever worried about. That I'm aware of, we don't have any apocalyptic cults in India. So, but this is, and so the concept of time is really cyclical. It's not linear. Celestial events often repeat. So the creation, preservation, and destruction of the universe keep repeating endlessly. The concept of avatars, or avatar translates to divine descent. I think commonly everyone would call this an incarnation, but I'll talk about why this is different. So these avatars come periodically, and they're mentioned in the scriptures, the conditions, the time period, and even sometimes the parents of the avatar are mentioned in the scriptures. So that's a way of them being identified. So these happen on a cycle. So say, for instance, there's a particular age, there's 4 different ages. So every cycle, like every 50 different cycles, there might be one age where this particular avatar appears, just as a hypothetical example. And there's many different avatars. So in some sense, they're scheduled. So they come during different cycles, and those different ages would focus on those avatars because that's what's considered to be beneficial to follow at that time. So space, so this is a little bit about cosmology, geography. So there's a mountain at the center of the universe, and it's called Meru, which basically means peak. It's surrounded by 7 different oceans. And so these are listed in the scriptures as being salt water, sugarcane juice, wine, clarified butter, or if most of you, I think, would know, it's called ghee, yogurt, milk, and water. And there's also 7 continents that are scattered around this peak. And so I've listed the names of all of them. And we're actually on Jambudvipa. So we're actually on this island here. So it's actually on the southern side of this peak. So and when they do religious ceremonies, they actually will state where you are and which phase of the moon you're in, which month, which season, which year in the cycle of 60 years. And they would even state which, we're on the southern side of this mountain peak, we're on this Jambudvipa island. And I've heard some people say that we're not on that island because we're in the United States, but I've heard other people say that that island actually encompasses all of the earth. So I've heard both perspectives. So So there's 33 deities that are mentioned in the Vedas, and this list actually also continues in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. So this dates from 700 BCE. And these are the 12 Adityas. So they're a group of 12 different deities. The 8 Vasus, another group of deities. The 11 Rudras, Indra, and Prajapati. So these total to 33. And 33 crore deities of Hinduism originate from these 33. So they're expansions. So all of these are understood to be manifestations of the supreme Brahman, which is I guess, another way of saying the divine absolute. So now all of you are wondering probably what crores are. So crore is it's a Sanskrit number. So there's 1, there's 10, there's 100, 1,000, 10,000, and 100,000 would be called a lakh. So even if you go to India today and they talk about large sums of money, they would term the amounts in lakhs of rupees. Then there's a million, which is tens of lakhs. And then there's 10 million, which is a crore. Or in Sanskrit, so crore is the British term for koti, which is a Sanskrit term. So I put this story in here because this will hopefully address why, I'm sure a lot of you are wondering, so why do you have 33 and why do you have 33 crore? And you talked about one supreme absolute. And so why are there so many? And so there's a story in the Upanishad where Yajnavalkya, a sage and an authority on the subject of Brahman, arrived in the meeting of learned priests who were discussing the subjects from the scriptures in the presence of a king, King Janaka. And some were delighted at his appearance and others resented it because they were jealous. And so there was one priest named Udalaka who didn't like Yajnavalkya's presence. So Udalaka began questioning Yajnavalkya on a variety of topics. And although Yajnavalkya didn't approve of the method of questioning, because he sensed an ulterior motive behind it, he still answered all of Udalaka's questions. So after some time, the questioning turned to deities, and Udalaka repeatedly asked only one question, and so their dialogue progressed. So Udalaka said, "Tell me, Yajnavalkya, how many deities are there?" And so Yajnavalkya picks a number and he says 3,339. And Yajnavalkya says, "Tell me their names." And so he says they are the large forms of God based on qualities, performance, and different attributes. So Udalaka asked this question again, "Tell me how many devatas or how many gods there are." And he says 333. He asks it again. He says 33. He says, "Who are they?" And then he lists the 33 that I just mentioned, the 8 Vasus, the 11 Rudras, the 12 Adityas, Indra, and Prajapati.
No.
And so then this conversation just continues, and he says, how many deities are there? And Yajnavalkya says 6, and he says, "Name them." He says, "Agni, Vayu, the sun, earth, sky, and heaven." And then he asks the question again, and he says 3. This time he names them as Prithvi, Antariksha, and Diyu. And then again, the question is repeated. Now he says there's 2. There's prana and anna. So prana is life force, and anna represents grain. So, but anna has another significance too. It also represents seed. So it would represent the sperm actually. So the source of life. "Tell me how many deities are there?" Now he says 1.5, and he says Vayu, which is air, and Vayu rules over prana, the life force, because one's life is connected to one's breath. And then at the very end, he says, "Tell me how many deities there are," and he says there's just one. And he says prana is the supreme Brahman. So one's life force is the supreme form of God. So, and I put this in here to just show that part of it has to do with the person who's asking the question. And Yajnavalkya's answers change because Udalaka's understanding is changing as they're going through this conversation. So before the class started and before everyone was added to the meeting, I shared that I had done this presentation at a church, and there was a seminarian who was at the church, and they asked me the same question, that you keep saying that there's one God, and how come you have so many, and how come there's gods that look like this, that, and the other. And I have more pictures I'll show you. And I'll show you what some of the temples look like. And there's a lot of images in a lot of different forms. And the question that I asked the seminarian was, what was your concept of God when you were young? And he was probably in his mid-30s, and he had also changed denominations in Christianity. So I think he was raised Pentecostal, and then he joined the Disciples of Christ. So different denomination, different perspective, different outlook. So I asked him, I said, is the concept of God that you have now different from what you had when you were a child or what you were raised with? And he said, yes, it's very different. And I said, so has God changed or have you changed? And he said, I've changed. And so do the gods look different, or does a person look different? And it's a question you have to ask yourself. And the answer is, I think everyone knows the person's actually changed. And so based on their experiences and based on the knowledge they've gained and the research they've done and their own personal experience and realizations, the face of God looks different to them. And the qualities of God, or the qualities that God embodies for them, feel different. So I can say from my own personal experience, when I was younger, God was sort of like a super parent, and parents were no fun, but a super parent was probably not fun either. But I think as I got older, the face of God changed from being less of a parent and more of a friend, more of a lover, more of a companion. And I think that just has to do with my own maturity. The very definition of, the supreme absolute, of the supreme Brahman or God, in any tradition is that he's unchanging. And so the real variable in this equation is us. And our needs change, our perspective changes, our wisdom hopefully increases. And so therefore the appearance of God and the attributes that God embodies will change over time. So Uzma, I don't know, I just preempted your question, but go ahead.
No. There's actually a different question in the chat that I wanted to go ahead and interrupt you on because you asked us to. So this question is from someone in the audience. In Islam, this life is a test and then the afterlife follows. Can you explain karma and the concept of reincarnation? Are we jumping the gun on the rest of your presentation, or can you answer that?
Yeah, I can answer that. I'm going to go over, there's a slide on karma. There's a couple of slides on karma, and I talk about life, death, rebirth. Mm-hmm. So I'll definitely go over that. It's probably in a couple of slides.
Okay, awesome. And then I have a question.
Yeah.
So when you were talking about the 33, and I think I'm going into the jealous priest. Is it 33 times 33? Because I'm like sitting here trying to do math. I'm like, how did he come up with 3,339? Because it should be 1,089. So no,
I don't know. That's just I don't know if he just gave a random number.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So that's another interesting thing. A spiritual seeker should ask out of genuine interest to learn. And I think here Yajnavalkya was just throwing a number because he knows that the student is asking more as a taunt. And so all the scriptures start with an aspirant asking sincerely, because if one asks sincerely, then it doesn't matter what the response is. Even if the teacher's upset at you and they yell at you, there's stories in the scriptures where the student goes off and they repeat the curse that the person gives, that they just cuss them out. They repeat the cuss word and they actually attain enlightenment. And it was because their intention was genuine and the teacher just threw something at them, but they took it saying that, okay, you know what, this is meant for me to progress. And their intent actually delivered them. This is very interesting. So I think that initial conversation and the number probably, I'm not sure why 3,339, but I don't think there's anything wrong with your math, Uzma.
Okay, all right.
All right. So the next thing I want to cover, and this is something that I actually included the slide. This wasn't in the original presentation that I did previously. One, because I feel this would be meaningful to a Muslim audience. And the second reason is because there's a lot of videos on YouTube by, the only way I can describe him as a Muslim apologist. His name is Zakir Naik. And he does a lot of talks about Hinduism because he's originally based from India, but I think he's banned from India. That's last I heard. And so a Hindu would come up and ask him a question about, about a Hindu deity or something. And he would quote back saying, your own scriptures say that God has no form, that God has no attributes, that God is, all pervasive and, can't be contained in an image or can't be conceived of in the mind. And what he's saying is true, but the challenge is that there's two sides to this argument. There are scriptures from the same body of scriptures that talk about God as being saguna. Guna means attribute, so saguna means with attributes. And this would be where God is kind and merciful and beautiful and handsome and resplendent and effulgent, and all of these qualities that can be perceived by an embodied being like us. So they would describe his form as being captivating, and having a certain number of arms, or maybe looking just like we do, having long curly hair, having beautiful eyes that look like almost like lotus flowers, and decorated with different ornaments. So these would be describing God with attributes. Now, the same body of scriptures have portions which talk about God without attributes. So where they negate all the attributes and they say that he has no form because he's beyond form. He has no name because he's beyond names. He has no attributes because he's beyond attributes. And I think all major religions have this idea that God is a contradiction. And you can't just explain God by writing like a paragraph or writing even a book or writing even a series of books, because he is a contradiction. He can be embodied and he can be beyond having a form. He can be kind and merciful, and he can be transcendent and without any qualities. So I just wanted to mention this because having qualities also, and this is important to mention, having qualities does not mean one is limited, because the way God has form in the Hindu tradition does not mean that the form is limited like ours. And the best way I can explain this is his hands can eat, his feet can see, his eyes can walk. For our bodies, our eyes will see, our feet will walk, and our hands can pick up things. And for God, no part of his form has any limitation. And so it's viewed that way as being, so even his form is completely divine, and it isn't limited in any way that our form would be considered to be limited. So that's why I just wanted to include this. Now, saguna also means that this is meant for people who are living in this current reality. So you have form, and so therefore perceiving God with a form is more beneficial, and it's easier to wrap your head around. And this is why God is shown with forms in temples in India and abroad. And this is why Hindus have images which are permitted by the scriptures. The major difference, I think, with the Judeo-Christian tradition's perception of idolatry and the worship of images in Hinduism is actually not very different in my mind. There are examples in the Bible. I can't think of any examples in Islam because I'm suspecting that they don't have any, because I think they're very careful about that. But in the Bible, there are examples. Like a perfect example would be the Ark of the Covenant, where God actually instructs the construction of this ark with images of cherubim that adorn the top of it, and very specific instructions about the dimensions and the type of wood and the gold leafing and how the cherubim are supposed to be seated facing each other with their wings outspread, and how the ark is supposed to be kept and venerated, and who can have access to it, and how it should be employed, are exactly the same as how the Hindu canon talks about the creation of images that are meant for worship. It talks about the materials, it talks about the proportions, it talks about whether they should be clothed or not, and what is permitted and what is forbidden. For example, if an image is made out of metal, it cannot be made reclining. because metal images are supposed to be processional. You should be able to carry them in a procession, and carrying a reclining image in a procession is sort of like a funeral, for example. So there are restrictions on the materials. There's restrictions on the form, the attributes, etc. So it's not arbitrary. And I think my understanding of idolatry would be where you just fashion something out of your own imagination and then conceive it to be God who cannot be contained in anything. And I think the scriptures, especially in Hinduism, where they talk about the fashioning of these images, these deities for worship, are very, very specific. And also the worship is very codified. So most people at home would actually not have images that they worship because it's very labor intensive. They have to essentially be treated as if they are completely alive. And I think most people struggle to even have a guest in their house. And this would be like a guest that basically never leaves. So you have to be prepared to take on that responsibility if you have that. So I think this is something that I think comes up in people's minds. And I wanted to clarify how it's not arbitrary. They're very specific, and there's specific instructions in the scriptures that permit this. It's not done just from the imagination. So Uzma, I don't know if there are any questions about this.
Not about this in particular, but I think this might relate to what you just spoke on. In Judaism, the Ark of the Covenant has mystical properties, but is not divine. It contains the tablets of the 10 Commandments, which are symbolic of the entire body of law. Does that sound like what you're describing here with the...
So, Uzma, I'm glad you brought that up. So when the Ark got destroyed, did the 10 Commandments get destroyed? Or when it went missing? Did they go missing? They didn't. Mm-mm. And so the same with Hindu images too. They can be consecrated, and if they're destroyed, or if they're defaced in any way, which has happened over the centuries, it doesn't mean that God is affected in any way. And the scriptures actually talk about how an image that is defaced, certain ones can be repaired, certain ones have to be disposed of. You have to put them in you have to put them in a river, or you can put them in the ocean, or they can be buried, and so on. So they're very specific instructions, and I think the instructions matter less. I think the fact that it's codified and it's not arbitrary, I think that's the most important thing. Another example I've heard about this is you can put your letter in any box, but only if you put it in a mailbox that's recognized by the US Postal Service will the letter go anywhere. And that's the belief behind these images, that they really have to be made a certain way in order to be suitable for worship. And there's an entire body of scriptures that just talks about that. So, yeah. And the Ark of the Covenant, I think even with Christianity, especially when they have sacred art, the idea is that they say that the art is kept for reminding them of the divine, and it's not worshipped as the divine. And in my perspective, I think it's a nuance, because my personal understanding is that if you have eyes, then you should look at something that reminds you of God. And you have these 5 senses. And in Hinduism, the worship actually involves all your 5 senses. Like, you should hear things that are divine. You should hear these divine mantras being chanted. You should smell incense that evokes this sort of devotional mood in you. And so they're really trying to use all your senses and engage them instead of negating the senses, because that will never work. The classic example is in Buddhism. If you try to think of nothing, you're already thinking of something and you're stressing about it. Mm-hmm. So, and this goes again back to worshiping with attributes. And this is the initial approach, because if I just told you God is without attributes, then what are you going to do with that? And you can't continue to live your life as a person who's embodied, to conduct yourself and have a satisfactory life.
Yeah. The same person who made the original, the reference to the Ark of the Covenant, says that God doesn't need items or physical manifestations, but people do. So I think that lends to what you just said.
Correct. Yeah. And it's actually interesting that later on, there was also, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Moses was asked to create this bronze image of a crucified serpent when they were being tormented by poisonous snakes. And it was interesting that this image was miraculous, and then the image actually goes away after a while. Like I don't know if it's destroyed or lost, but it's interesting that they actually venerated that image of the crucified serpent, and it protected them from being bitten by snakes. And even if the snakes did bite them, the poison had no effect. So it's very interesting that I think there's aspects of this that are there in other traditions, but time has its own effect too. And I think when you look back, you're sort of looking through this distortion of history and your own personal context and understanding, and that always changes things. So, and that's true of me too. So I put this in here because I always thought it was very interesting that when you talk to Christians, they will vehemently argue that the Trinity is one God, and they're almost relationships within the Godhead. And but they all actually function in different ways, and they're spoken about very differently. I love when I was listening to the Catholic radio station, the nun who was speaking said, "The Holy Spirit is not a bird," and I thought that was really funny. But it just goes to show that how do you show something like that? Like if you choose to show it, you have to show it in some way, and even that representation is going to be limited. So, but it doesn't mean the divine is limited in any way. And I think this representation is really to show the relationships within the Godhead, but it doesn't mean that they're separate people. And I think that's sort of, there's that tension in the Trinity. And even in Hinduism, you have this is our Trinity, where they're basically showing God and all of his attributes personified. It doesn't mean your kindness and your mercy are separate entities, but they can function in separate occasions. And so I think they're all shown differently. And this is really just, again, going back to that idea of they are one once you realize they are. And as long as you don't, then they can be different because you think they're different. And it really has to do with where you are in the journey. So this is a lot more crowded than the Trinity painting before, but I think, again, they're just showing the different attributes of God personified. So even here you see Vishnu reclining, and you have his two consorts, and the consorts are basically for boga and moksha, for earthly enjoyment and then for salvation. And so they reside within him, but they're shown as if they're cradling him as his consorts. And consorts are basically supposed to, in Hinduism, whenever a deity is shown with a consort, the consort is supposed to be their potency, without which they're powerless. So they're actually very, very potent. To worship a deity with a consort is supposed to be more effective. And the deity is always invoked with their consort, because otherwise the belief is that they're not going to be very effective for whatever you're petitioning them for. So this is a photograph of a temple tower in South India. This is the very famous Meenakshi temple. And you can see this proliferation of images and how these are all shown, and they're all part of they're part of the Hindu subconscious. So when a Hindu sees this, they don't get overwhelmed. I think the ordinary person would. And these are all shown not to really say that God's all different, but this is all part of that one temple tower for one particular deity. So this is like the multiplicity that you see in the world, and God is a reflection of that. So just like in India, you would probably have throngs and throngs of people visiting the temple, but can you look at all of them and say that we're actually all part of one being? So just like you have millions and billions of cells in your body, but they're actually all part of one person. And it's very interesting if you go with the cell analogy. It's when a cell tries to only look out for itself is actually when it goes haywire. And then you have something like a cancer where the cell is only thinking of itself and proliferating, and it's not thinking of serving the whole. So I think that's a great example. All right, so karma. So there was a question about that. So it means action. It's the law of cause and effect. There's 3 different kinds. Karma is any action that leads to a material body. Vikarma is an action that leads to a harmful reaction. And akarma is activities that have no material result. So I think of all of these, akarma is probably the most useful. So all spiritual activities, if done sincerely with a positive intention, do not give you a material result. Of course, if you pray to God for a car and God gives you a car, then it has a material consequence, because now you have a car, you can get a flat tire and paint job and so on, and it needs to get serviced, or you can get a speeding ticket. But if you pray for something that has no material existence, then your act of petitioning God for that has no material consequence. So devotional activities in that category would be called akarma, or no karma, no material reaction. So here's another quote from the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad with our same sage Yajnavalkya. So now as a man is like this or like that, accordingly he acts, and accordingly as he behaves, so will he be. A man of good acts will become good. A man of bad acts will become bad. He becomes pure by pure deeds and bad by bad deeds. And here they say that a person consists of desires, and as is his desire, so is his will. And as is his will, so is his deed. And whatever deed he does, that he will reap. And essentially and I would add to this, that whatever he thinks of, he becomes. And so all devotional practices, and I can say this hands down, regardless of tradition, you become like what you focus on. They always say you become like the company you keep. And you also, like if you think good thoughts, then you become good. And if you think positively, then you feel positive. And then positivity manifests in your life. And even if it doesn't, you tend to focus on what's positive in your life. And that itself is a benefit. So, and here, if your focus is constantly on God and the divine, then that is what you will attain. So rebirth. So I'm sure everyone has questions about this. So rebirth is based on karma. It's also based on desire. If you desire to be with God, then there is no cause really for you to take another rebirth, except for things that you have already done. And that's the challenge. So this is Hinduism's way of answering the question, why do bad things happen to good people? So perfect example, why are these children starving in Africa, for instance? What did they do? They didn't do anything bad. They were just born that way. Why do they have to suffer? It's so unfair. How could God do this? And so the idea behind this is that and this is what I was told when I was a child, so I'll share this with all of you. If you waste food in this life, then you are creating the circumstances for not having food in the future, because you didn't value something that was given to you. Now, I want to qualify this by saying it does not mean that people who are suffering do not deserve help. And there is a risk that you run if you think this way, that you can say, well, they got what they deserved and maybe they just need to suffer. So, and I'm not advocating for that, but it helps explain that, okay, this is why they're suffering, and it's something that I should never do. I should never waste food. I should value it. And even if there's food that I don't want to consume, there might be someone who needs it. That's just a very simple example. I don't know if I answered the question on karma with this. I hope I did.
I'll connect with them and see if that
Okay.
worked or not.
Perfect. So a little bit about avatars. So these are considered divine descent, is literally what the term avatar means. Entire sections of the scriptures are devoted to listing the avatars. The amount of divinity differs between the different categories of avatars, so they're not all the same. Some are temporary, some are eternal. So I'll give you a perfect example. So in the Hindu community, they consider Jesus to be an example of a particular kind of avatar based on the gospel accounts of him. So if he has a completely human nature, for instance, then he would belong to this Shakti Avesha avatar. So basically he He becomes a conduit for the divine. And now, if he's completely divine, that's a different avatar. So maybe there's two perspectives about that. But there are avatars. Say, for instance, this one, Parashurama, where he's wielding an axe. So he was human, and the divine force descended within him for a period of time in his life. So his images are not kept in temples and worshipped because the divine force actually withdrew after it had accomplished what it wanted to in his life. And so he's actually not, he's not considered to be a complete incarnation. The complete incarnations, there are others here that are listed that are worshipped in temples. So the worship differs based on their completeness, as I mentioned, or purnatva. So purna means complete. So depending on how complete they are, they're more likely to be worshipped. If they're complete, they're considered to be a complete descent of God. So incarnation means to enter flesh, and these avatars are not all considered to be embodied in that sense. So I'll give you an example, like Krishna and Rama are not considered to have human bodies. So they're not really entering flesh. Their bodies were divine. Krishna's body actually multiplied at one point and became 16,000. So it couldn't have been a body made out of flesh and blood. And so I think that's the difference between the term avatar and incarnation. So the easiest way to convey the term avatar would be to say incarnation, but it isn't entirely accurate, because I think the word incarnation came about for Christianity where they were specifically focusing on God entering flesh. So I made this quick slide on yoga. So most of you have probably heard of yoga or talked about it. So yoga means yoking. So it's actually yoking the self with the divine. There's many different kinds and combinations. So the most common one that I think everyone thinks of is hatha yoga, which is the physical poses that mimic various animals. And they combine techniques of syncing the body, your physical body, which is in a pose, your mind and your breath, to create alignment and harmony. And so it's something it's sort of a mind, body, breath practice. So if anyone's familiar with a sun salutation, the sun salutation poses are connected to whether you're inhaling or exhaling, for instance. And that adds a whole different dimension of complexity. If any of you have worked out in the gym and you've had a trainer where the trainer says like, inhale, exhale, I always get them confused. But it's sort of like that, where you're not just doing an action, you're also keeping track of whether you're inhaling, exhaling, or holding your breath. There are some poses where you just hold your breath. Just very quickly, the breath actually is connected to the mind. They all, even in Western science, they talk about if you're stressed, you're going to increase your heart rate and you're going to increase your respiratory rate, and you're more likely to hyperventilate. So if you slow down your breathing, you're going to calm down, your heart rate is going to slow down. And the idea is that hopefully your mind slows down too. So when your mind's going a mile a minute, then all of the other vital signs are going to go off the chart too. And so yoga really uses the concept of be in your body, feel your body, align your mind and your breath, and just slow down and just be in the moment. And so that's why it's very popular and it's quite effective. There are other kinds of yoga that use mantras, which I'll have a slide on mantras, external modalities of worship. And these can be used in concurrence with hatha yoga. So you can be worshiping while you're actually in a particular hatha yoga pose, like the lotus pose, for instance. You can do your entire physical worship with that pose because it's supposed to align your spine and help you concentrate. So mantras. So mantra literally means that which delivers by contemplation. So it delivers the mind by preventing it from spinning out of control. So these are sacred sounds. They can be even syllables. So Om is supposed to be a syllable, words in different combinations outlined in the scriptures. They can be from a variety of sources. There's even folk ones. And there's Puranas and Tantras. Interestingly enough, because of the Muslim audience, there are actually Muslim Tantras in India that are practiced. And they're actually called the Sulaimani Tantras. And so they have a lot of overlap with the Hindu tradition. So I think some of the folk practices of charms and sort of casting spells and things like that would be something that a Muslim audience might be familiar with, but it overlaps in some ways with the Hindu tantras of sort of writing prayers and putting them in lockets and wearing them, or inscribing them on gemstones and wearing them on a certain finger of your hand on a certain day for a certain number of days, for instance, or repeating a certain prayer and wearing it for a certain amount of time, for instance. So those kinds of practices would all be from the body of scriptures called the tantras. They bestow various benefits. So you can literally practice a mantra, practice for a short amount of time for a particular goal. There's practices like if you want to conceive a child, if you want to go to college, if you want to graduate, want to pass an exam. And then there's ones for if you want to get liberation. There are lifelong practices of those mantras. The repetition of mantras called japa. So some of you might have heard that term. And you can either chant with a mala. So that's like a string of beads. Usually they're 108. And 108 has to do with the constellations. So there's 27 stars in the cycle of constellations, and each one has 4 parts. So that's 27 times 4. So it comes to 108. There's a lot of other reasons why they use 108, because that number comes in different for other divisions, but usually they're 108 beads. You can chant without counting, just something that you do nonstop all the time as a way of calming your mind or controlling it. And there's also ways to chant where parts of the mantra are inhaling, parts of them are holding, parts of them are exhaling. So, and mantras can also be chanted without counting on beads. You can count on your fingers. That's traditionally what I do. And the idea behind counting on your fingers is that you're actually activating the nerve points in your fingers, which connect to all different parts of your body. And so it sort of is a way of placing the mantra all over your body by just using only your hands. My teacher told me that, Krishna, you have to chant this mantra 1,000 times a day. And he said, you're not going to use beads. Because I used beads once, and he asked me, how long did it take? And I was like, it took me an hour. He was like, it should take you longer than that. So, because with beads, you can really go faster than you're actually chanting. And then you're like Mickey Mouse the whole thing, and you're like, yeah, I'm done. So, and that's when you actually need a teacher who's going to be like, hey, you know what? Maybe you shouldn't do it that way. So he actually showed me a way you can count to 1,000 on your hands. And so you just keep, each division of your hands is 20. And so you go around once, you go around another time, that's 20. You go one division. So you do 200, and then you keep alternating hands as the counter. You do that 5 times and you've done 1,000. So this is something that I can really do anywhere. I can do it on a flight. I can, I don't have to whip out prayer beads and or carry them and then worry about them breaking or security or whatever. So very interesting. So I know in the Islamic tradition, they have prayer beads too. So I thought this would be something interesting to talk about.
They also have the tradition of counting on their fingers.
Oh, they
which
do.
Again, it's the mind and the tactile, the brain finger connection to make you more mindful and slow you down.
So is the count, is it 99?
It's 15. It's for us, it's 99. So you go 15 around your hand, because each finger is 3 sections. So you could do 15 like that. And that's how you count.
Interesting. So in Hinduism, the middle finger, the 2 middle segments are not counted on.
Oh, this one right here.
Yep. So you basically would start from here, you go here. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And then you go 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. So this one and this one are not counted on. It's kind of interesting. I've seen other ones where they go all the way around and just don't chant on the middle one. It's like you're keeping God in the center and you're going all the way around.
Okay, yeah. No, we utilize all 3 sections, and it's 30. So you go around twice, and then you do a third. What the pinky gives you the 33, and then you just start all over again for the next round of chants or incantations that we have.
And I've seen the digital counters on Amazon stuff. Those
are cool too.
Those are very cool, and I've used those, but it's very interesting. Like Hindus and Muslims are the ones that are all posting feedback about those. So,
Which counters work?
yeah, because like if you're doing like a fire sacrifice, you can't hold the beads in your right hand because you're making the offerings in your right hand.
Oh yeah.
And you can't use the beads.
And you have to use the beads on your right hand. Yeah.
Correct. And so you can't use the beads in your left hand. So the only thing I can use is the counter. Mm-hmm. So I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah. We got to get together with the Catholics and discuss.
Yeah. Yep. All right. So this is the end of my presentation. So I don't know if there's any other standing questions.
There was one that I missed because I was busy taking notes. So this goes back to the deities. Can you explain the difference between Lord Vishnu and Shiva? Who is supreme? Are there followers, devotees? Do they have debates or arguments with one another? That's half of one question that this person asked. So do you want to start with that?
Yeah. So Vishnu and Shiva are, so Vishnu is supposed to preside over preservation. And the followers of Vishnu would always say like creation, preservation, destruction are the three activities. So you create the universe, you preserve it or sustain it, and then you destroy it. Shiva is involved in destruction. And so the followers of Shiva will actually say that, what are you looking for in this life? You're looking for liberation. And how do you get liberation? The only way you get liberation is by the dissolution of this identity. So actually the greatest grace that actually comes is from a dissolution of all of this so that you are reunited with the divine. The followers of Vishnu have a very interesting point. They say that actually it's easy to create, it's easy to destroy. It's really, really hard to maintain something. And so they put him at the top saying that in order to, it's almost like if you want to balance something, it's very difficult to maintain that balance over a long period of time. And so the stories about Vishnu are always about how he saves the world from destruction and he saves his devotees from peril. And so he has, he's very popular with a lot of the devotional cults in India because he's very appealing. Like the stories of Rama and Krishna are all about, how he rescues his devotees and they have a very loving relationship with him. I wouldn't say one is supreme over the other because those again come from the Puranas. If you read the Shiva Purana, it talks about how Shiva is the greatest, and even Vishnu pays respect to him and praise to him. If you read the Vishnu Purana, even Shiva worships Vishnu, and Vishnu is the supreme. So I think it's relative, but it's just really meant to, I think ultimately you have to sort of discard all of those on your journey and realize that they're actually all one.
All one, yeah. And then the second question that this person asked, in the Mahabharata, there was a fight between Lord Krishna and Shiva. Is that why there are two major sects or are there more? I'm not familiar with the sects, so maybe you can talk about that.
Yeah, actually, I'm trying to think. The story of Shiva and Krishna fighting is actually in the Bhagavad Purana. I'm not aware that it's in the Mahabharata, but that story was done because Shiva was protecting his devotee who had basically gotten this boon from him that if I'm ever attacked, you will defend me. And Shiva and Krishna are friends, but Shiva was in this unfortunate position where he had promised the king that, this demon king, and now he had to fight Krishna, whom he loved. And so that was part of that story. And Krishna, when he sees Shiva on the battlefield, is just shocked, thinking that, I thought we were friends and now you're raising your weapons against me. So, and in that story, it's very interesting that Shiva actually gets defeated by Krishna. And the demon king has 1,000 arms and all his 1,000 arms get cut off by Krishna's discus. So,
are there two major sects though, as a result of that story?
I think the devotional sects, I would say there are two main followers. So Shiva and Vishnu, but I'll give you an example. I belong to a tradition that worships all of them as being the same. It does not mean that my particular practice will focus on all of them equally, but there's no distinction between them. So we would go to temples for all of them. The followers of Vishnu tend to avoid everybody else. So like the Hare Krishnas are actually an offshoot of that. So they will not go to a Shiva temple. And if they do go, they'll stand outside and say, we will not go inside.
Wow.
So I think that's some medieval enthusiasm that they have, but yeah, but I don't do that, and most people don't.
Okay, I didn't know that. Okay, there was a question that I wrote down, And if anybody has any other questions, I would post them in the chat box now. If you want to unshare, then we can all see each other.
Okay.
And that might help. And then you can maybe preemptively see the chat box as well.
Okay.
One of the questions I had was the soul, the Atma. You said that was a part of God.
Mm-hmm.
So is there a tradition in Hindu tradition of how the Atma gets there into human beings? Is there a story behind that?
Oh, like this sort of the fragmentation?
Like the breathing of the soul that we have in other traditions. Is there something like that in Hinduism too?
That's a good question. So in the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna has to fight this battle where he has to kill all his own relatives. So as his enemies, he actually sees his own loved ones, his uncles, his cousin brothers. And so he has this moral dilemma where he then asks Krishna for advice, that Krishna, I can't fight this battle. And Krishna tells him, you have to fight this battle. It's your duty. You're a warrior, and your job is to function on the battlefield. And so in order to teach Arjuna that you're not killing them because their soul is eternal, so it sort of gives him it detaches him from that situation so he can conduct his duty as a warrior and fight to defend his own kingdom and to defend his own family. So Krishna mentions that he said there was never a time when you, nor I, nor all of these kings on this battlefield did not exist. So he's basically saying that the Atma always existed. Now your question of how did it become plural? I don't think the scriptures really talk about that. Mm. But they do, I think on a very large concept, they talk about Brahman, they talk about Maya's illusion, and how basically Brahman had this desire to become many, and then the many became this multiplicity that we have. And every soul is basically looking for, they're looking for Ananda. Ananda is bliss. And so if you think about it, every single living creature is looking for happiness. And no one is satisfied because the happiness we're looking for is being one with the divine, because that's where we came from. And so every little thing makes us happy, but usually it's not for long. Some things more than others, but that's what we're all searching for. And so, so I think some schools talk about, it's like you live this life and you're pious, and then you're reunited with God and you're rewarded for your devotion. And I think for others, there's a philosophical tradition where, so once you have that realization that you and God are not separate and you are one with everything, is when actually you will actually see God in everything, and you will see God in yourself. So there's nowhere you need to go. There's nothing you need to do, because you have that experience of him as being all pervasive. So I don't think that really answers your question. I've not.
It does. I feel like it does. So, I don't see anybody else posting any questions, so I'm going to keep going because I have a bunch down here. The devotional cults really interested me because I don't understand how they came about. I guess it was through the historical scriptures that you mentioned that they appeared, but when did we start seeing them? And, do you think it's a function of the Orientalism that happened, or because they started coming and labeling the scriptures and timing the scriptures and doing all of that, and people had to choose because somebody else told them to?
Right. So I think I would say it was almost like a revival movement. So if you look in the Middle Ages, so the Hare Krishna tradition, the tradition of chanting that Hare Krishna mantra, it actually comes from India. So Chaitanya Mahaprabhu was a saint that was considered an avatar, who was born in the Middle Ages. And he advocated for the best thing that you can do is just chant the names of God. It's the easiest thing to do in this age of, of confusion and quarrel, where people come from backgrounds which may not permit them to effectively follow all of the laws in the scriptures. And they may not be entitled to worshiping according to the way it was laid out in the scriptures. They may come from mixed backgrounds. They may be in interfaith marriages, for instance. And so they may be precluded from some of those activities. So he advocated this very simple way based on one particular Purana. And so that sort of became like a revival where it was sort of just add this to your life and nothing else needs to change, and then God will do the rest. Even Sikhism, for example, came around that same time, which was sort of a break from the story. I think goes that that Nanak actually was going to have his thread ceremony, which is sort of like the Hindu bar mitzvah type thing. And he saw his family squabbling with a priest over exactly how the ritual should be done. And he just was he was just turned off by it, that he just said, there's got to be something simpler. And so he said, and so there's even a poem that he wrote, like, I don't wear this cotton thread, I wear the thread of devotion and stuff. But it's very interesting. I find it very difficult to speak with Sikhs because I think they're very enthusiastic. And I have the unfortunate position of being from the parent tradition. They came as an offshoot. And I'm thinking, but you know what, guys, like, you still have 5 things that you always need to carry. Like, you're not that different. So, and they're against worshiping images, but they still have a book, and their scriptures say, like, don't be like the Hindus who worship images, because if you throw them in the water, won't they sink? How will they deliver you from the ocean of existence? If you throw their book in the water, it's going to sink too. So it's very interesting how, like, the offshoots have a very different perspective, but I think they all came about for a reason.
Okay.
Yeah.
On that note, you did mention certain rituals for certain people. So are there Hindu rituals that not everybody can do? So
I didn't touch on this in the presentation, but I mentioned the castes. And so the castes are, they make a big deal out of this. And I think part of it is because the British who colonized India really wrote about the caste system in a way that misrepresented it. And then I think that it became the understanding that the Indians themselves had about the caste system. And it eventually ended up being something that divided, Indians were divided against other Indians over this understanding. In the Bhagavad Gita, Krishna talks about the castes, but he talks about the castes as being a division of labor based on one's propensity. So if one is prone to waking up early in the morning and is prone to always being clean and organized and prone to being calm of mind, then they are more suited for priestly activities. And they're more suited for learning more advanced spiritual techniques. And so that became the priestly caste. And then it became a family tradition, but not everyone who's born in that caste has that propensity. My own family, I was born in the Brahmin tradition, in the Brahmin caste, but I'm the only person in my family who follows any of it. So, and it wasn't taught to me, which meant that learning about it and trying to practice it was a challenge, but I felt it was my calling. Even the Samaveda, which I'm learning to chant, and my teacher is horrendous. I love him, but he asked me to send video recordings because he wants to see how I'm counting on my hands, because you essentially become like a musical instrument.
Yeah.
He wants, and the comments he gives me are, Krishna, your mouth is correct, your hands are not. Your hands are correct, your mouth is not. So it's literally like you're learning music and you're chanting at the same time. But it was a sacrifice that I made, and it takes a lot of time every day to do it. But again, not everyone who's born into the family follows it. And I think that's okay. But I think the understanding of the caste system, I think, is sort of distorted by the media. Europe in the Middle Ages was feudal. And no one talks about how bad that was. It was just the way they organized labor. And why did they organize labor that way? Because people didn't live beyond 20, 25, 30. If you were 35, you were probably toothless and a great grandmother. And there was no concept of choosing your profession and higher education because there was no time. But if you look at what came out of that time period, some of the most beautiful things came out from that time period. It's because literally you apprenticed and learned from the time you could walk, talk, and speak. And that's how they all became master artisans in such a short amount of time. And they didn't live long, and they all died of like very common things. Like the flu would kill them, and then they had plagues. So I think even for Brahmins, they would learn this chanting from the time they would speak. And so it was very easy for them to learn 3,000 of these verses that I've only learned, I think I've learned less than 10, and it's taken a year and a half. Because
Okay.
each one is very difficult. And so I think there's a time component. And so I think that's why the caste system was prevalent in India, but I don't think it was ever meant to be something that was for persecution. The British also did use it to divide Indians. And so there were, so they sort of, and I think the way you write about something changes how people perceive it, because then the written record becomes the authority. And I think the lived experience sort of fades. And I think Islam has suffered from that too, because I think the way it's talked about becomes the dialogue, unfortunately, and
Right.
everything else sort of fades.
He who has the pen has the story, right? Writes
Correct.
the story. Yeah. There's a question that just came up. This is a nice one. Is Krishna and Radha a story about sacrifice of love so Krishna could achieve divinity?
So Krishna and Radha, there's different interpretations. They're shown as divine lovers, and the way I understand it, it's supposed to be the love between the soul and God. And the way Radha pines for Krishna and all the poetry that's written praising them is really to show that this is how the love should be between the soul and God. And they should be like lovers. So I would say it's almost like the Hindu Song of Solomon. And the love between Radha and Krishna is described extremely erotically. They even have a role reversal. There's a story about where after a night of lovemaking, they dress in each other's clothes. So when they emerge from the bower in the forest, Krishna is dressed as Radha and Radha is dressed as Krishna. And the idea behind that is that there's so much in love and there's so much in union with each other that their identities are irrelevant. The lover and the beloved have become one. And so now the beloved is the lover and the lover is the beloved.
That sounds like a lot of stuff we read in Humanities too. Yeah. Divine love. Absolutely.
Yeah. But I don't think he has to sacrifice it, but there's this concept. So they're just like Saguna and Nirguna, there's this concept of Sanyog and Viparyog. So Sanyog means being in union with God, and Viparyog means being in separation. And there's more scriptures that talk about Viparyog because we're supposed to be in separation from God now. And in separation, you think about God more. And the perfect example is, Azra, for instance, I'll pick on you, your grandchildren. So when your grandchild is with you, your thoughts of them are not as absorbing as when they're away from you. So when they're away from you, you're thinking, oh, he's probably eating now. He's probably sleeping now. I wonder what he's doing now. And so even this idea of being separated from God, you pine for him. But I'll give you an example. When I go to the temple, I hardly think about God. I'm just trying not to get pushed over. And I'm trying not to trying to cut the food line. I'm sure this happens to everyone. I don't know if it happens in a mosque, but
yeah. Cut the food line sounds right.
Yeah, cut the food line. Oh my God, let's bum rush to the bathroom before everyone gets there. So, but when you're having that moment by yourself and you're in contemplation, that's when you actually have that union with God. In some sense, you're still separated, and that's when the thought becomes more intense.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that beautiful explanation. It just reminds me of absence makes the heart grow fonder, and that's true of not just people you love, but also God. So thank you so much for that. And thank you everybody for tuning in tonight. We know we ran 3 minutes over, but we appreciate your patience, your questions. And if you have any additional, you can always email them to ISBA and we can ask Dr. Akilesh to please answer any other questions that you have. Thank you so much again. If anybody would like to come back and check, I believe this recording will be made available to share in your social circles and in your interfaith circles. And we would really, really appreciate that. Make sure when you do that, you advise everybody or gently suggest that they also donate to the ISBA so that we can continue this kind of programming. Thanks so much, everybody. Thank you so much, Dr. Akilesh, for your time.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Thank you, everyone.
It was a beautiful presentation. Thank you, everybody. Have a great night.
Good evening.